Senator Abeler to your A22 amendment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. This is probably my sixth effort to make a difference with some individuals who live in actually Coon Rapids and around the metro in a housing that's called LIHTC. And the name of the corporation that owns them is well known. I am not here on the floor today to impugn them, except by reference. And the question, Mr. President, that reflects around this is, how do you legislate morality? How do we legislate ethic when it comes to business practices? How do we tell a company that, here, we'll give you some money to go set up some low-income housing, and then please treat these people with the respect as though you were a company that was not for profit because you cared and you wanted to serve. And Mr. President, it's my opinion that in these projects, there's plenty of money to be made at reasonable rent increases. The way these are set up, the one in Coon Rapids, it was a $30 million project. The feds provided $10 million of tax credits, and then the investors had to go borrow 2/3. And unfortunately, what somehow they got the idea was they could get a return on all 100%, and really none of the money in there is even theirs at risk. They're regulated through Minnesota HFA and through some federal agencies to limit the rent increases as a number. Unfortunately, area median income, which is the current index, ran afoul of trouble during the COVID time when it went up 12%. Many of these companies did not raise rent 12%. This particular company did and continues to hit the ceiling at every possible time. And so, and good for that, Mr. President. This is a great business, and we're making money. Unfortunately, the individuals who are there are income limited, and so they move in getting $25,000 a year. Rent was $900. It's all great, and it creeps up to the point now that some of these, especially widows in the place I represent, are paying $1,700, living on $2,200 a month, and they say, what are we supposed to do? And they've tried every way to Sunday to find a way to study these programs, and we had some ideas, that one of which was unconstitutional. Senator Hoffman might remember in one of the bills we tried to control this rent thing. So that didn't work. We had an idea about how about related to the income of these seniors. And so this is my effort to provide a thimbleful of relief. And so it says, could you please only charge the lower of area median income or the CPI. And I think it's reasonable, and I think it would just provide, as I mentioned, a thimbleful of relief to these individuals and help them stay in their homes. And Mr. President, I believe it's in the interest of many people that I ask for a roll call, so thank you.
Roll call requested, roll call granted. Senator Port.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Abeler, for bringing this amendment. It's something we've talked about for several years. I will say that the day that we discussed this in my committee was probably the worst day. I've chaired a committee. Listening to these folks come in and tell their stories about seniors who were now paying 50, 60, in one case 72% of their income to their rent was horrifying. They had signed up and taken, signed leases in a low-income apartment building, and it didn't stay that way. And Mr. President, this is not a new kind of rent control. This is simply a readjusting of the formula that already exists and is supposed to keep rent stable for these seniors. Mr. President, members, I know there are lots of feelings about rent control, but we do put guidelines on folks who have taken taxpayer money in order to build their properties. This is simply a readjustment of the formula that is used that I think will more accurately represent the change in income for the folks who live in these communities. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Lucero, we are on the A22 amendment.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I want to thank Senator Abeler, Senator Port, and others. This topic is very, very challenging. We have seniors, those on fixed incomes, that are being squeezed. And that hearing, I concur with Senator Port, was definitely not fun. And Mr. President and Senator Abeler, I spoke to some of your constituents after that hearing, and I explained to them it's just heart-wrenching. It is a reality that those on fixed incomes are getting squeezed. It is also a reality that we have precedent in this state when we enact rent control. It is a further detriment to the cost of housing, to the supply of housing, and I cannot support this amendment. Whether it be property taxes, whether it be the increasing of insurance costs, whether it be the increasing of the cost of goods, materials, or the cost of labor for maintenance, things continue to be more expensive. When costs go up, the price has to go up. So I am very, very sympathetic, again, to Mr. President, to Senator Abeler, his constituents, and constituents in similar positions across the state. But this is treating the symptom. It's not addressing the root cause, which is increasing those costs, which drive then the cost of rent. So again, thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Abeler. I appreciate your effort. I appreciate the diligence that you have in serving your constituents and your community. Unfortunately, this is just not the way that we need to go. So I would encourage a no vote. Thank you.
Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Senator Port, in talking about this amendment, described it correctly, that this is rent control. And Mr. President, we have seen this as a failed experiment here in the state of Minnesota before. We don't have to look any further than the capital city here in Minnesota to see how rent control had a chilling effect on housing options being developed for Minnesotans. We got to see canceled developments. We got to see slower economic growth. We saw people leaving the city in response. And Mr. President and members, I fear that pursuing a path of more rent control will lead to fewer options and less competition for these types of for this type of housing. How you address higher housing costs is by having more housing, having more options. And this, Mr. President, will send a chilling effect at anyone who is looking to develop this kind of housing here in the state of Minnesota. Because this might be the standard today, but the legislature could change it in a session. They could continue to tinker with that number, and that makes it so that housing providers cannot plan when they're looking to make an investment. And so, Mr. President, I would urge members to vote against rent control. We've seen this experiment played out. We know it doesn't work, and this isn't the right solution today.
Senator Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. President. I stand in support of this amendment. I initially heard of this problem in 2022, door knocking in the community, and I will say the owners of one of these businesses tried not to let candidates in because they didn't want us talking to the residents. And we found out when we finally were able to talk to the residents why. It was because they were raising rent that year 12.5%. And so we have been working on this since I got here and many of us got here in 2023 because that time there were people in my community and these other communities around the metro that when there is a 12.5% increase in your rent and you're a senior on a fixed income, you end up homeless. So there were seniors in my community because of that ended up living in their cars, that had to move with each other in one bedrooms, which is kind of not what you want to do in your golden years. A woman that had to move back in with an ex-husband, and they were concerned that might have been an abusive situation, and a lot of people that had to go get jobs. I agree that we should do more to address the root problem. But in the meantime, these seniors have been going year after year, slowly getting driven out of their homes with nowhere else to go. I just got an email yesterday, unsolicited, they didn't know this would be on the floor today, talking about how their Social Security this year is going to rise 3.6%, and they just got letters saying that their rent was about to rise by, I think it was 6.5%. And again, they have said some of us are going to end up homeless again. And sadly, this is not a group that is going to hold on to these rent increases and any stability for years and years. The fact is, people in senior housing move on, whether it's to assisted living or they pass away. There are a lot of units that are turning over. So if these companies are still looking to make a profit, there are still ways that they can do rent increases as the apartments turn over, but not to the seniors on fixed incomes that will end up homeless. And that is what is happening. So I think until we do more work on the root problem, we should not continue to kick this can down the road year after year while seniors are ending up homeless. Thank you, Senator Abeler, for this amendment, and I hope people vote green for our seniors.
Senator Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. President. And to the good senator from Anoka, thank you. This has been a long, drawn-out debate, and it goes back about 7 years ago. So if you would pertain, Mr. President, I want to tell you the history of why we are where we're at right here. We've tried multiple occasions and had meetings with certain companies. And it's not about rent control, folks. Just let's get this cleared up. It's about doing the right thing for some of the most wonderful people in the world, our elderly. How can you say no to Grandpa and Grandma in this case? When you as a company start a Section 42 housing development, you say, whew, we're going to do some wonderful things. They're getting a 33% investment back from federal tax dollars. So for example, in Coon Rapids, there's a certain building that a certain company built. It's about a quarter mile from the river, Mr. President. This is very germane to the conversation at hand. And they built it for $36 million. $12 million went right back in the developers' pockets with the assumption that they were going to keep the rent affordable for our elderly. Lo and behold, the law establishes that you can do your area median income to raise it. Plus, there's a HUD advantage that can you raise that again, in the sense that the good senator from Anoka said 12% interest. That's tough. We've tried every session. Matter of fact, the good senator from New Hope said to me one time in caucus, if you do this provision, I'm not going to vote for your bill because you guys are tapping into some other kind of federal thing that we didn't even want to go down the road in because I had no idea what she was talking about because she speaks 18 different languages. But having said that, that's how much we've been talking about this issue. Senator Abeler's good amendment establishes a doorway that says we can finally get to this issue that's in front of us. And I don't need to remind you on this one either, Senator Abeler. Do you remember the certain vice president who said, we get to raise the rates on our elderly because the law allows us to do that? In my office, in front of Senator Abeler and in front of a person from the other body who happens to be from Coon Rapids. Thank you, Senator, for bringing this amendment. Members, do the right thing for Grandpa and Grandma. Let us go in there and keep going with what's right for Grandpa and Grandma and vote yes.
Senator Joyheim.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator Abeler, for bringing this amendment forward. Very A for creativity. I think I told you that before. But the bottom line is still rent control. And I am just so pleased that we have all these different members realizing we have a problem in housing. My 9th year, I've been a broken record for 9 years complaining about housing units. And I know two things, Mr. President. I know we have a shortage of housing units. Basic supply and demand. When you have a shortage of something, the price goes up. And that's why every time we have a housing committee, I talk about creating more units. So I know that. That's the first thing I know. We have a shortage of housing units. And I know the basic principles of supply and demand. Studied it in college. The other thing we studied in college, which we saw firsthand, and Senator Rasmussen mentioned it earlier, right here in St. Paul, is that when you enact rent control of any kind, you have a decline in new products or new production of new housing units. So why, when we're short 100,000 units of housing, would we enact rent control statewide on a certain segment that probably needs it more than any other segment? I've also heard federal tax policy mentioned. We have zero control over federal tax policy. And then, you know, I could go on for an hour on a dissertation on rent control, Mr. President, but I just urge everybody to vote this down. I am happy to work with any member on this subject. I have some ideas that I think would help, but it would take a bipartisan group to work on some serious policy change across our government subsidized housing. But rent control is not the answer. It's been proven worldwide. For 60 years, they have studied rent control, and it does not work. Thank you.
Members, we are on the A22 Abeler Amendment. Senator Grudenhagen, to the amendment.
Oh, thank you, Mr. President. Yeah, I have to rise in opposition to this also. I know Senator Abeler and others who support this, their heart's in the right place. In my insurance agency, I probably got 400 to 500 seniors insured through Medicare supplements. Some of them wind up in nursing homes, assisted living, other things. I've had them crying in my office already because of the cost, and they can't afford it. And I agree, we are in a crisis here, okay? But members, what we're doing here, in my opinion, rather than turning the burner down on a boiling pot of water, we're simply putting a lid on the boiling pot of water. What do I mean by that? Well, I happened to keep something from the Housing Committee a couple years ago, and I'm sure it's worse right now, but I think this illustrates the point. Again, this came from the Housing Committee a year or so ago. It shows that the average home in Minnesota cost $523,000 to build at that time. If you look at North Dakota, it's $425,000, about $100,000 cheaper. If you look at South Dakota, it's $350,000. If you look at Nebraska, Illinois, Wisconsin, even Indiana, Michigan, they're over $100 and some thousand cheaper to build the same house. So members, putting a lid on rent control, you're not turning the burner down. What should be done, you should look at why the costs are where they're at, what's driving the increases, and then find out what regulations and government laws we've passed to accentuate this. So you need comparative data with states around you to see what they're charging, and then make the necessary changes. It's kind of what Senator Draheim has referred to. This is not going to help. It's like experience has been shown. When you put a lid, you get shortages, and the costs are even higher, or the people who build these facilities, they'll go elsewhere. By the way, one other thing, when you grow government 40% in 2 years, it's going to push the price of everything higher because it's an expense on the private sector. So members, when you want to look at the crisis we have in housing and also in this area, I would advise you to look in the mirror because you'll find the culprit is staring at you. We need to reform what we're requiring these people to do. Thank you, Mr. President. Vote no.
Any other discussions on the A22 before I go to the author of the amendment for the last word? Senator Coon.
Thank you, Mr. President. And as I'm looking at the amendment, I'm wondering if Senator Abeler would yield for a question.
Senator Abeler, will you yield? He said he will yield. Senator Coon.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Abeler, looking at your amendment, it applies to projects awarded tax credits under this section in line 1.5 of the amendment. What are the tax credits that that's referring to, and are they federal tax credits or state tax credits?
Senator Abeler, to the question.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is a federal program, and the tax credits are federal. Oh, I'm supposed to look at you, sorry. You're both so handsome, I don't know where to go. So the tax credits are federal. Minnesota, there is some state allowance in how to set up some of the operational parameters, and this is within that allowance.
Senator Coon.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator Abeler, for that explanation. I'm really struggling with this because I've heard a lot about rent control, and I agree fully that rent control as a theory doesn't work. It does lead to higher prices. Fully understand Milton Friedman economics and all that good stuff, but the market is completely messed up here, and we're talking about projects that are being awarded tax credits and taxpayer dollars. So if you as a developer are going to accept this tax money for your project, you should expect certain strings and conditions that the government has a right to place on that, including how you can raise rent. What I'm struggling with here is that this, to me, appears to be a federal program, and it seems to me the federal government should be the one that places those terms and conditions on the tail end of it to the developers rather than the state government coming in. So I'm really struggling with it. I'm not sure. I don't think it's as simple as saying rent control bad, therefore vote no. I think it's more complicated than that, and I appreciate you offer the amendment. Thank you.
Senator Duckworth, we are on the 822. It's your turn to speak. Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate it, and I'm glad that Senator Coon had an opportunity to speak before I did, because I think he touched on something that I think is warranted when you give consideration to the amendment offered by Senator Abeler. I'll be the first one to stand next to Senators Lucero, Draheim, and Rasmussen and say that rent control across the board as a policy or a law of the land in the state or in our country is a terrible thing. It's been proven. We know that to be a fact. But I also agree in some fashion with what was shared by Senator Hoffman, and that I don't necessarily think we're talking about that kind of rent control here. As a matter of fact, I kind of agree with what Senator Coon had to say when we talk about a government program having certain requirements in order to be eligible to participate in that program, or in this instance, get taxpayer dollars. And so I would ask if Senator Abeler would yield for maybe a question or two, Mr. President.
Senator Abeler, will you yield? He will yield. He's right across from you there, Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll resist the urge to look at him. Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Abeler, when we look at this bill, the amendment that you're proposing, could you help me understand, are we talking about a broad rent control law that would be sweeping across the entire state of Minnesota, impacting renters and landlords from the Twin Cities to the suburbs to greater Minnesota? Or are we talking about a very specific subset of folks in a particular item that you're trying to solve?
Senator Abeler, to the question.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I'll just keep it brief. This is a very targeted amendment to a very targeted program. If you do not have federal tax credits and agreed to provide affordable housing as part of the criteria, then you are not affected at all. And in fact, if you're a nonprofit, which also runs some of these things, which they've made a point to not increase rent to any amount beyond what they absolutely need, they will not be affected either, because they already maintain a rent increases far below. It's just those who have been maximizing the rental increases on these people who are vulnerable that would be affected. Thank you.
Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would ask if Senator Abeler would yield for one more question, please.
Will you yield? He will yield. Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Abeler. So, Senator Abeler, if I was a property owner, if I was a landlord, whether I owned a single-family home in Lakeville, or maybe a 4-unit property in Anoka, or maybe even I owned an apartment building in Minneapolis or St. Paul, if I didn't utilize any taxpayer dollars as a part of this federal program, would I be subject to these rental caps or restrictions that are proposed in your amendment, or would I be free to have whatever rental rates I saw fit for the properties that I own?
Senator Abeler, to the question.
Well, thank you, Mr. President, and the short answer is absolutely not. Only those investor groups who are pushing up on the limit of rental increases that would go beyond CPI and into the median income would be affected. No other anybody who has a duplex, a home for rent, a VRBO, fourplex, 92plex would be affected in any way unless it's part of this federal program. And just while I'm mentioning, Mr. President, it was suggested the feds could fix this. Mr. President, what can the feds fix? Thank you.
Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Abeler. I, like many of my colleagues, would express a little bit of unease regarding the topic of the amendment. But at the end of the day, I think when we're talking about trying to help a very targeted group of individuals, namely the elderly, who are struggling with the cost of living, which I'll have more to say about in third reading, Mr. President, so you can please put me on your list for that. I think there are things that we have to give some consideration to as legislators that help those that are the most vulnerable, the most in need, those that would most benefit from that help, while at the same time avoiding a massive sweeping mandate like rent control from taking place in the state of Minnesota. The only thing I would say, Mr. President, and urge of all of my colleagues is this: if this amendment passes, whether today or ultimately becomes law later on this session, I would urge us all and grant the strongest caution toward avoiding allowing it to become a slippery slope, which walks us closer and closer to that far more sweeping mandate of rent control in the state of Minnesota. Senator Rasmussen nailed it when he used St. Paul as an example. Rent control has decimated rental rates in building and construction opportunities. It's actually shrunk inventory and set it back. We can't allow it to become the law of the state. However, if we're going to use taxpayer dollars to help those in need, I think it's actually maybe quite reasonable to have some eligibility requirements we expect those to abide by when it comes to those who most benefit from that help that we're investing in, Mr. President. And therefore, I do see value in Senator Abeler's amendment. Thank you.
Members, the last voice we'll hear before we vote on the A22 amendment is that of Senator Abeler. Senator Abeler, to your A22.
Thank you, Mr. President. There may be a sigh of relief going across the chamber, but I do appreciate the really good discussion about this, and I agree with every person who's spoken, except that we shouldn't do anything, that part. We should do something. And so St. Paul's rent control experiment was an absolute failure, because it included everybody, and builders weren't building. But I think, Mr. President, if we, in partnership with the feds, are part of a program that we put money in this case, 1/3 of the money that's going into this place under the raise your right hand and promise to keep the rent affordable, using an index that made sense at the time, which actually found out to be a flawed index. And as a result, the very people who sold their homes and moved into this place are now paying more money than they paid for their former mortgage and home expenses, where they now risk becoming homeless. I think at that point, it's our duty to weigh in and to say, no, we can do better than this. And so this is more a reform than any kind of control. There's already rent limits on here, rent control. These are rent-controlled apartments. But the index needs a little updating. We update things all the time. And Mr. President, I want to also make it real clear that when you vote for this, you realize this is an imperfect solution. It's an answer that may move the discussion forward. And you appreciate, and as a way to show your concern for these families and these widows and people with disabilities, et cetera. But I think if you vote no today, it doesn't mean you don't care. It means you don't like this particular solution. But I think the Senate as a whole is going to say, we need to find a way to keep these units affordable. And I hope that those entities who are listening today, whose name I did not use out of respect for them, would understand that as a Senate, 67 of us, well, 66 of us, care about that. And I think they'll care too. But this is a thing. And so don't be abusing the people. We've given you money to help, and you have a duty, a responsibility on your oath to take care of the individuals that we've put my neighbors' funds into, our funds, our rich and poor people have chipped in money to help this happen in the name of helping the people who need the help the most. So I want them to know this group is unanimous and concerned about that problem. And so, Mr. President, I thank those for the good conversation today. Thank you very much.